today, I mean, if you look at kind of the dominant mainstream academic research on the media today in kind of, the prestigious academic journals, I would say to this day the conventional wisdom is in scientific circles is that, media actually has extremely limited effects. So the puzzle for us is, how do we go from a world in which the early 20th century, there are all these ideas, people like Edward Bernays, right, that we've talked about, and these cybernetic ideas about, media affecting society at large in this kind of systematic way. How do we go from that cluster of ideas that's very kind of influential with the rise of mass media in the early 20th century to this kind of contemporary consensus or conventional wisdom in the academic literature, which suggests that actually media has quite modest and limited effects? So that's both a kind of, that's a question that is interesting both in terms of trying to get to the truth of the matter of what media's effects actually are. So in that substantive way, this is an interesting kind of change in kind of the evolution of our way of thinking about media. But it's also in its own right kind of fascinating as a historical change, because perhaps, this is kind of what I think, and I think you'll see why as we go through this. It could very well be one. It's kind of complex, but it's quite plausible to think that if the media has, if there are, let's say, massive systemic kinds of consequences from information technological innovations, basically evolution in kind of media technology, it's quite possible that could in turn actually shape how human beings study it or don't study it, okay? And that's going to be basically one of the contentions that I make in today's lecture. It's going to be that I actually think the evolution of how academics conceptualize and study media effects is itself kind of shaped by larger systemic information technological innovations, okay? That's very abstract, but hopefully you'll see what I mean as we get through it. So, okay, so that's kind of how, the overview, if you will, and kind of to look at the bullet points. Basically, just to recap what I just said, we're going to try to understand how we've moved from these ideas about major media effects to what is called limited effects. And I put limited effects in quotes because it's actually known as a kind of school of thought in academic political science of the media, okay? Up until now, academic political science of the media has actually kind of been relatively on the back burner of this module. We've mostly been talking about very big ideas and large-scale kinds of historical changes and hypotheses at that sort of level. But now we're really kind of we're going to be kind of foregrounding more specific mainstream academic approaches to political science. Okay, in particular, the school of limited effects, which I'll explain in detail later. I'm going to try to share with you the basic insights, the knowledge that has been produced in that limited effects school. Okay, that's kind of the limited effects school is basically kind of the rise of a mainstream institutionalized academic social science of the media. All right, so I'm going to try to crystallize for you, at least in the first iterations of sophisticated scientific modern academic research on media effects. What did we learn from that kind of first wave or first school of thought? All right, to this day it remains influential, but I'm going to give you not just the background of what it was, but what we learned. Again, I kind of alluded to this, but I'll just sort of say it again. What I'm also really interested in is why were the systemic approaches and these kind of large-scale, kind of grand theoretical visions of how media might affect society on a large scale, why were these kind of approaches and ideas replaced by what was a much more narrow, specific, kind of linear statistical modeling approach, okay? That's because that's what the limited effects school was. I'm going to go over all of this, all right? But the question is why. And then I'll talk about, at the end, if we have time, or if not, this will might bleed into the next session. I'll talk about the larger implications of these things. Why are we talking about these things? Why are these changes in the study of academic, the academic study of the media and its effects? Why does it matter? Why is it interesting? And more importantly, how does it fit into the kind of larger narrative that I've kind of been building in this module? These ideas about possibly long-term shifts in kind of cultural, rationality, and perhaps, developing a kind of high-level abstract explanation for a whole slew of social and political trends, right? That I've been kind of trying to build piece by piece. I'm going to try to connect all this back to that. All right. So that's the plan. So what do I mean by this kind of massive effects school of thought, if you will? Well, basically, from the 1920s to the 1950s, let's say very roughly, there were a lot of very influential thinkers who were more or less agreed that mass media, the rise of modern mass media, was coming to have extraordinary kind of system-level or society-wide effects. All right? So to give just a few examples, I've mentioned many of these thinkers and figures in previous sessions, but I'll mention a few more here and kind of lay them out. People such as Edward Bernays, people like Walter Lippmann, these sort of early kind of authors who were reflecting on the nature of public opinion and psychology and how the masses, how exactly the masses, millions of people in a country such as the U.S. or whatever, were going to respond to the rise of a mass media society, how they would be affected in extraordinary ways, and how we can use the media to have extraordinary effects on society at large. Okay, we've talked about both of them a little bit. Those are just you don't have to go and read everything about them, but these are just kind of signposts for important figures, right, and ideas and time periods. So Norbert Wiener, who I've mentioned before as one of the kind of founding figures of what is called cybernetics. Cybernetics is something we've gone over, right? This idea that, human beings and machines and social systems can kind of all be thought of along the same lines, with the same concepts, as basically having to do with communication and control, as systems of communication and control, through basically different forms of feedback, right? That's kind of in a nutshell, that's kind of the basic cybernetic kind of framework for understanding a wide variety of different systems, basically. Right, so Norbert Wiener is kind of the genius figure that's associated with, one of the genius figures that is associated with that kind of scientific movement, okay? Then other people that so I mentioned him before, right? But these are all people, basically who were born, at the end of the 19th century or at the, very beginning of the 20th century, and who are writing and thinking and having a lot of influence on kind of, the world of ideas around between the 1920s up into even the 1960s or so. So Marshall McLuhan, for instance, is someone that I haven't talked about yet, but he's sort of a really famous, very influential theorist of media, basically, who had his kind of prime time in the 50s and 60s. Interestingly, he's a little bit different than these other figures what I should say is, all of these figures are very different, but he's especially different than if you compare him to someone like Norbert Wiener. I'm going to talk more about these figures in just a minute. The point I'm getting at, folks, what all these people have in common is that they all more or less believe that, media would have, significant effects at a society level. All right. So McLuhan, I have a whole slide on him in just a minute. I'll tell you a little bit more about what exactly he thought. But then you even see political scientists, actual, people like in my field, sort of, that are, somewhat traceable to my, you could trace a lineage from like me as a political scientist in my field in the journals that I read and publish in and the work that I do, to someone like Carl Deutsch, who was a political scientist, very much in swimming in the same ideas as people such as Norbert Wiener. Okay. Anyway, these are just a bunch of names and figures to kind of give you some signposts for a large number of people who basically took it for granted that the rise in mass media was going to have significant effects. One could cite others. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about those two, just two in particular, and then the question is going to be, in around the 1940s and 50s, this sort of attitude of thinking about media in a systematic way, in a large scale way, in a kind of macro political way, becomes, it sort of, it loses its appeal and starts to be replaced by a totally different view. Okay, so what we need to do now is kind of just, I want to characterize for you, what exactly is this conventional wisdom of massive media effects. So if we start with someone like Marshall McLuhan was hugely influential in the 50s and 60s. Interestingly, he was, not really a scientist. Okay, he was basically an English professor. He was a Canadian English professor. But he wrote a handful of quite interesting and certainly brilliant in their own way books. They weren't very scientific, but he was, he's sort of thinking very creatively about media. And one of his most famous phrases that he's very well known for is this idea that the medium is the message. Okay. And I think that, the meaning of that is fairly straightforward, but I'll explain it a little bit. And it's basically this idea that, when the television, for instance, is not significant for the actual messages that it's, beaming into your head. That's actually quite irrelevant. What is much more significant is this new thing that is in your living room that is shaping how you think and how you relate to the environment, right? So, many people might think that the message is the message, meaning television is significant because of what the talking heads on the news channel, because of the words that they're choosing or what exactly they're telling you, what those news anchors are telling you. And he kind of is very famous for saying that's not at all what's important about the media. It's how these devices and these different formats for transmitting information have qualitative kind of society-wide effects, right? So he had all of these big ideas about how television would completely sort of rewire the brain, and how when all we had was books and we learned how to read print, and that was our main way of consuming information, that led to a certain type of literacy and a certain type of mental functioning. Whereas television, if you watch a lot of television, that kind of your capacity for objective literacy is going to be decreased, and you're going to, he called television like a participatory medium. So all about engagement. And he basically had all these big ideas. If you read these books, it's filled with all these kind of crazy conjectures. Some of them I think are prescient and reasonable and quite suggestive and useful to think about. Some of them I think are, he's kind of, it's a lot of guesswork. It's just a kind of brilliant, creative kind of theorizing of what might maybe be happening. But he doesn't test things with data. He's not super sophisticated in that way. He's a theorist, basically. Right, so he had all these big ideas about how different media technologies fundamentally transform human mental processes, not through the content of the messages, but through the devices themselves. So, for instance, he distinguished between like hot media. He had these terms where he would call some media hot and some media cold, and he basically thought that they basically had they encouraged or induced different forms of cognition depending on the medium. Okay. So that was his big idea. The point is, if you want to, if you're interested in that, if you want to learn more about specifically what he thought, you can go read his books. It's not going to be a lecture about him, but what I'm trying to do is give you a sense of some of the most influential and popular ways of thinking about media, as far as up until the Marshall McLuhan was influential in the 50s and 60s. Okay, so that's not a very scientific approach, but he was hugely popular and influential. And another thing that's important about kind of mentioning Marshall McLuhan is that as we're going to see, the academic study of the media kind of branches off into different subfields. Okay, and so in the more scientific fields, like my fields, where we use statistics and quantitative methods and public opinion surveys to try and make scientific inferences, that becomes one kind of niche of media research. But then there are all these other humanities fields, in departments like communications departments or media and journalism departments or English departments that are studying media. You can find lots of modules in media in there and lots of scholars who publish in journals about the media. So they're doing academic research and often about the political implications of media, but it's purely theoretical. They're just kind of thinking and writing and reading books and writing about these kind of interesting ideas. So Marshall McLuhan is an interesting example of someone sort of from that other type of media research. So if you're an English scholar and you write about the media, you might cite people like Marshall McLuhan a lot to this day, but political scientists don't. Okay, so that's just to give you a little sense of the sociology of the academic research a little bit. So, as I'm trying to paint this picture for you of what how people thought about the media and this kind of massive effects mode of thought, I thought it would be fun to give you a little audio-visual sample of Marshall McLuhan. So here's a little clip that I found of him and some of his ideas. Okay, so you can I can spare you of my droning voice for 4 minutes, and we can watch this nice little video.
Instead of going out and buying a packaged book, of which there have been 5,000 copies printed, you will go to the telephone, describe your interests, your needs, your problems, and say, I'm working now on the history of Egyptian arithmetic. I know a bit of Sanskrit. I'm qualified in German, and I am a good mathematician. It'll be right over. And they at once Xerox, with the help of computers from the libraries of the world, all the latest material just for you personally, not as something to be put out on a bookshelf. They send you the package as a direct personal service. This is where we're heading under electronic information conditions. Products increasingly are becoming services.
Global Village is not created by the motor car or even by the airplane. It's created by instant electronic information movement. The global village is at once as wide as the planet and as small as a little town where everybody is maliciously engaged and poking his nose at everybody else's business. The global village is a world in which you don't necessarily have harmony. You have extreme concern with everybody else's business and much involvement in everybody else's life. It's a sort of Anne Landers column writ large.
Another strange effect of this electric environment is the total absence of secrecy.
I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream.
The new is always made up of the old, or rather what people see in the new is always the old thing, the rearview mirror. The future of the future is the present. And this is something people are terrified of.
She speaks by telephone to head office, where her variations are taken down directly onto cards.
I try not to have any private meetings, Frank, but I think of technologies as extensions of our own bodies, of our own faculties, whether clothing, housing, and more familiar kinds of technologies like wheels, stirrups, such extensions of various parts of the body. The need to amplify the human powers in order to cope with various environments. I have, by the way, a peculiar reading habit that I've developed in recent years. I read only the right-hand page of serious books. If it's a frivolous, relaxing book, I read every word. But serious books I read on the right-hand side only because I've discovered an enormous redundancy in any well-written book. And I find that by reading only the right-hand page, this keeps me very wide awake, filling in the other page out of my own noodle.
Hier was de hoofdtelefoon met ingebouwde stereo FM radio.
In een speciale televisietoespraak aan dat benzine op de bom gaat.
But forgive my impertinence, but has anybody asked you why you are sometimes difficult to understand? Because I use the right hemisphere when they're trying to use the left hemisphere.
Okay, well, I'll try and get back on the road.
Do you see that when the people, ordinary people are trained to try to follow it and to connect everything you say with what they last heard, they're not prepared to use their wits. They're only prepared to use the idea they picked up the first time and try to connect it to another idea.
Okay. So you kind of get a little bit a sense of the zeitgeist. The zeitgeist I'm kind of trying to characterize. A lot of ideas here about, the electronic media would make a global village, which would, totally change the nature of what we talk about and how we think about things. The media as extensions of our body, as extensions of our nervous system in some sense. Very abstract ideas, very creative ideas, provocative ideas. Not necessarily no scientific testing per se, but he's just kind of a guy looking around and thinking about things, making creative theoretical pronouncements. Okay. So this is kind of this sort of style of thinking about the media and arguing about the media effects was, kind of very much the zeitgeist of I think for a while, at least from about, I'd say, the 1920s to the 1960s, the kind of conventional wisdom was these sort of large abstract ideas about how mass media would be changing the nature of society. Okay. Right, and this style that you just saw, people like Marshall McLuhan, he would have a lot of influence, and there'd be a lot of spawn, if you will, of Marshall McLuhan, and they would be talking about the media and studying the media, mostly in kind of English departments and humanities departments. Okay. Meanwhile, you also see a similarly massive effects kind of mentality in even harder, more scientific areas, right? And so Norbert Wiener is kind of most known for that, perhaps. He's sort of one of the, there were lots of kind of genius thinkers in the middle of the 20th century thinking about the kind of scientific implications of media, or rather thinking about the social and political implications of media in a kind of properly scientific way. Norbert Wiener was a proper kind of mathematician, scientist, proper kind of prodigy type genius figure, but he also wrote popularly about the effects of information technology. Okay, from this kind of cybernetic perspective that we've talked about a little bit about, and so that was I had you read a sample of one of his kind of popular books written for a popular audience this week. His book called the Human Use of Human Beings. Okay, and to be honest, he's not he's not an excellent writer. It's kind of hard to follow. He kind of writes about all these different things, and it's not usually in a very compelling order. But it's very fascinating, and there's lots of really good stuff in there. You just have to kind of sift through it and kind of have an open mind towards it. Anyway, the reason for kind of drawing attention to him a little bit more is that he was a proper kind of scientific mathematical sort of dude, and as you read in The Human Use of Human Beings, was also, like Marshall McLuhan, but from a totally different perspective, really convinced that the proliferation of information technology would have tremendous effects on, the nature of human being, right? But from a totally different perspective with a different kind of methodological approach. And so these two figures kind of just give you a good sense of how widespread was the basic idea that, of course, the rise of mass media and information technology, the innovations in information technology of the 20th century, of course, these would have tremendous effects on politics, on people's attitudes and behaviors, okay? All right, so that's just kind of painting the background. Just one little quote out of the Norbert Wiener book. It is my thesis that the physical functioning of the living individual and the operation of some of the newer communication machines are precisely parallel in their analogous attempts to control entropy through feedback. Okay, that's just kind of a nice little illustration of what he's basically trying to put forward. Okay, he's trying to draw out the implications of that. Now, here's the puzzle. Around the 1950s, a alternative way of thinking about the media and a different set of methods, a different kind of institutional background, different types of people start to gain prominence who see media in a very different light and actually become very skeptical of whether the media is having any of these effects on people. All right. So we want to understand a little bit about why. So one thing is that, so the reason we're talking about cybernetics is that, this whole science of cybernetics associated with people like Norbert Wiener, it would seem, at the time, it seemed like cybernetics was unifying the physical sciences and the social sciences. It seemed like, and what Norbert Wiener was basically trying to say, is that the way you study machines, you can also study humans in the same way. You can study societies in the same way. That societies, human beings, machines, they're all just cybernetic systems, guided by, feedback systems attempting to control entropy, right? That's what it says here. And so this seemed like we were going to be able to study the effects of media and information technology on society, just like we're able to study the human nervous system, okay? And it looked like everything was getting unified, and we were going to have this kind of burgeoning new science to understand how information technology would affect the world and us. But Wiener was also pessimistic about the prospects for this, okay? And if you read the readings for this week, you would have a sense of why. There are basically kind of two reasons. One is that, for science to work, you need a decoupling of the observer and the observed, right? So if you think about the physical sciences, then one of the reasons that the physical sciences work so well is that, if you're a geologist and you go and study rocks, those rocks, don't talk back to you, right? They don't respond to your measurement. If you go and measure a rock or whatever, it's not interacting with your attempt to study it. And also, on the other hand, we're relatively impartial about rocks. But when humans start to try and study other humans, all of a sudden this is not the case, right? So it's very hard to separate the observer from the observed. And, basically, if I'm an anthropologist and I want to go study a community somewhere, my studying them could actually change them, right? It could bring out aspects of them that were not otherwise there. So, you get the idea. With social sciences have these peculiar problems that make it uniquely difficult to do scientific research with human beings. The other reason being that we are kind of uniquely invested in human issues, right? We have deep biases, and we have deep reasons for having our attitudes kind of skewed about what we might find when we study human beings. Okay, so there are all these kind of peculiar issues, and then also just we don't have, it's hard to have really, really good data in long time series. A lot of the data that we have actually measures different things under different circumstances, which is, makes it difficult to make really promising, strong kind of scientific inferences especially about kind of large scale things, such as, trying to understand media in a society as, the nervous system of that society. Well, you can't really study the media of society like you can study the nervous system in a body, because any measure you have of the media is going to be much harder to get, basically. It's going to be, how do I put this? Like, if you want to study the nervous system, you can get a human being in a laboratory, and you can basically control all of the different extraneous variables. You can more or less hold them constant. But if you want to study the media in a society, you can get good measurements, every day. You can measure things, you can build these time series data sets. But there's going to be so much chaos and other sorts of things going on under the hood, and we don't really have a way to control that. Okay, so in principle, the point is that in principle, in the way that we actually understand how things work, there was every reason to think that you could understand society and physical systems in more or less the same way, but in practice, it wasn't going to. Wiener was pessimistic that it would actually work. Okay. And so, the pessimism was probably the more appropriate attitude in terms of predicting what would actually happen, because in fact, cybernetics disappears from the social sciences. It was this kind of fascinating and very powerful attempt in the mid-20th century to kind of unify physical and social sciences and potentially give us a kind of robust, mathematically grounded science of how things like media and information technology function as kind of nervous systems of the society, and we could kind of potentially analyze societies just like we analyze kind of biological, complex biological systems. We would be able to explain, all of these. We'd be able to make all these rigorous statements about the media as a nervous system of the society, just like we do of our own nervous system. It seemed like this was becoming possible, and then all of a sudden it kind of just goes away. It becomes passé. And in fact, when social scientists start to take really seriously questions of media effects, it's not at all in a cybernetic model. It's not at all the kinds of concepts and techniques that people like Norbert Wiener and Gregory Bateson and Margaret Mead kind of assumed would be the sophisticated development. It was actually a totally different kind of way of thinking about it and a different set of tools. And in particular, I'm talking about a very linear approach where you think about, a specific, like if I expose you to a very specific TV commercial, does that make you more or less likely to buy the product that I'm advertising? That sort of very specific, narrow question becomes the focus of media research. All right, and cybernetics, this sort of grand cybernetic mode of thinking, falls away. Okay, so why is that? That's something that we want to try to understand, but also just what are the different implications of that different approach? Okay. So let me characterize for you a little bit this sort of new mainstream social science that would basically take the spotlight and make kind of the cybernetic approach go away. One of the kind of flagship institutions was the Bureau of Applied Social Research at Columbia University around 1944. They basically pioneered the use of survey research and quantitative methods for the study of mass communications. So basically, like when you go and you research media effects research in Google Scholar or whatever it might be, most of the recent research that's influential is basically kind of in a tradition that is basically started by folks like the Bureau of Applied Social Research. Okay. The basic idea being, go and do a survey of 1,000 people, every day throughout a political campaign or whatever, and ask them what media they've been watching, and see if you do statistical analysis on that data set, and see if what the people who watch in the media causes effects on how they think or something like that, right? Also known as the Columbia School for short. The leader, you could say, and kind of the most influential probably figure in that kind of moment was named Paul Lazarsfeld. All right, and something that I think is important to note is that this sort of research was built on corporate and government funding. Okay, so they were often trying to solve very specific kind of instrumental problems for governments and corporations, specifically that were interested in persuading people. Okay, so all of this research, is important to keep in mind, was kind of colored by the very particular needs of kind of larger entities. Okay, namely, specifically around like persuasion. Right, if you're a business, you're going to want to spend a lot of money to see if you can use media to make people buy your product. Right. You're interested in a very specific, narrow way of thinking about media effects. Okay? So specifically, it's going to be individual level, right? You're going to be interested in how can you change people's minds to affect their behavior in specific ways. And it's going to need to be based on practical media campaigns that you can actually go and execute. All right, so notice the difference. This is one of the key differences between kind of the massive effects way of thinking that kind of was very popular for a lot of the 20th century to this new approach. Because, if you think about the media as a kind of nervous system for society, a kind of cybernetic system, like the human biological nervous system, but at the society level, well, that's a very different kind of level of analysis, if you will. That's not something that you can change as a corporation or a government in any kind of like immediately practical way. So in some sense, it could be true that the media has this kind of effect on the body politic that's kind of like that. So in other words, what I'm getting at is it could be true that the media has massive systemic effects on one level of analysis, but also for what governments and business people, for what they're actually interested in, that may or may not, that might just not be relevant, right? Because you're generally only interested in what you can effectively manipulate. All right? So we're starting to kind of see how both of these things could possibly be true. It could be true that media has massive effects, but if you're only interested in a very narrow, specific type of media effect, then you might, all the research on those specific media effects might turn out, oh, media doesn't have that much of an effect. And that's basically what happened. Okay, so a bunch of influential studies around the 1940s and 1950s went and tried to identify media effects using statistics. And in a nutshell, they all basically found that media does not have very strong immediate direct effects. In fact, it's actually pretty hard to find evidence that the media, directly can change the way people think in a predictable way, let alone behave in a predictable way. Okay, so these were some of the famous studies. I will go over them a little bit and try to kind of reveal to you what these early studies of media effects found and what how they designed the study and what the results were, and we'll try to kind of critically decode perhaps some of the limitations or the biases of these early studies. But by and large, they were all, the one thing that they kind of all had in common was they were basically saying, look, all you people, for decades have been talking about how media has all these significant effects and can brainwash people and this and that. But actually, we've tried really hard to collect the data and to design studies to identify these sorts of effects. And each of these studies in their own way basically said, no, actually media doesn't really work like that. Media actually only has, quote unquote, quite limited effects. Okay? And hence that's the limited effects school. So we'll look a little bit under the hood of these studies because they're very foundational, influential studies, okay? But why don't you take a break, stretch your legs, use the loo or whatever. Let's say 5 minutes. Chat amongst yourselves, rest your attention, and then come back in 5 minutes and we'll do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly go over some of these early studies, which, to be frank, are also kind of boring, okay? But that's kind of one of the questions that we're interested in, is like why does media research get so boring in some sense? So we're going to kind of pick apart those studies very briefly. I'm going to kind of try to go rapidly because they are kind of boring, to be honest. And then I'll try to spend most of the second half on the larger ideas and the larger implications, which I think are really more interesting, and actually some of it will actually be quite useful to you, I think. Okay, so with that as a caveat, thanks for your patience, and let's push forward to get to the interesting stuff. So we'll take a quick look at these really influential early studies, right? So the Erie County study looked at about 2,400 voters in Erie County, Ohio, and this is in 1940. Okay, right? So statistics are really quite simple and naive. Survey methods are really quite simple and naive. They had to kind of go around and ask all these people these things on paper, and then kind of process the answers by hand and do statistics using like punch cards. This is before computers are available, really, right? Microcomputers in the sense that we think of them as. Okay, so they basically go during the campaign of 1940, the presidential campaign. They go and ask people, 2,400 people, a bunch of questions, including things about like where they got their information from and how they chose to vote. Okay. And the product of this was a very, very influential early book in political science called The People's Choice, which was published in 1944. And this introduced what is known as the two-step flow of model, the two-step flow of communications, okay? And this basically kind of kicked off what is called the limited effects school. And so what is the two-step flow? The so-called two-step flow model is basically that, let me see if it's in here or not. Yeah. It's the idea that ideas flow from media to opinion leaders and then down to the less politically interested. Okay, so basically what they found is the media does not transmit ideas into people's heads, which changes their minds and then causes their voting behavior. That is simply not how it works. Media does not have that type of effect. And in part, it's because most people don't. One reason why is that most people don't pay that much attention to political news, right? But they argue that what does happen is that media puts out ideas. Those ideas go to the opinion leaders. So, highly intelligent, sophisticated people who are respected and trusted, right? Kind of think of like celebrity, or think of like expert, news analysts, right? Who's like an influential kind of media figure who you respect and you kind of trust their opinion, right? Like think of the Guardian columnists that you read or whatever, or the, if you're conservative, it would be someone else or whatever. Those are what they have in mind when they talk of opinion leaders, okay? And then based on the signals that you're getting from whatever your preferred opinion leader is, you then process you process those ideas through the opinion leaders, okay? Not through the media directly. And also, finally, there is who you hang out with, like who you see as your community, your immediate, what they call sort of the primary group, all right? That also affects how you process or don't process information, okay? So basically, there are these intermediate steps in the relationship between media signals and how you actually process them or don't process them. That's sort of the two-step flow. The first step being media puts stuff out there. The second step being how it's actually processed by the individual through opinion leaders. Opinion leaders can also be like influential people, not necessarily in the media, but people just basically it's whoever you trust and look to for endorsements. So the Decatur Study was a panel study of 800 women in Decatur, Illinois. A very similar kind of study as the Erie County study. And the outcome of that was a book called Personal Influence, which also presented evidence in favor of this sort of two-step flow or limited effects perspective, okay? Very similar, basically asking people about their media exposure and their attitudes and behaviors. Finally, the Elmira Study was conducted in Elmira, New York, and this looked in particular at the voting decision, and the result was a book called Voting in 1954. So again, this book in particular stressed the importance of small groups over mass media effects. So the primary group is kind of the technical term for that. Who you actually relate with on a daily basis affects, how you process news. And think about it. I mean, this makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Like when you read a newspaper or watch the BBC or whatever it might be, it might not be conscious, but how you interpret things is in part conditioned by what you're gonna be able to go say or not say with the people that you actually talk with, whose opinions matter to you, the people that you want to be liked by, the people that you see yourself as, the groups that you see yourself as a member of in your everyday life. You kind of process all the media signals that you receive. You process them through this lens that is largely conditioned by how you see your everyday group memberships, right? If all of your friends are kind of lefty progressives, you're simply not going to interpret any media signal in a way that they all are going to dislike, because we're social creatures. We don't do that. So we're highly shaped by the small numbers of people in our everyday life that we really value and want to be liked by and consider ourselves a member of, okay? Basically, what the research finds is that actually has way more of an effect on what you think or how you respond to media signals than we previously thought, okay? And so another way to think about this that makes sense is like if, think about your group of friends. If there's like one person in your group of friends who is kind of like who is like kind of most cool, or like just, think about it maybe in terms of like you think about like your class, if you will, like your student body, in whatever year you are. Like there's probably like in all social structures, there's like a hierarchy of like popularity, right? And like some people are cool, right? Some people are like less cool. This is just a reality of social life. This is always the case in some degree, right? So if you think about the people that are seen as cool, if they adopt a certain idea, it's going to be more likely to be adopted by other people, okay? That's the basic idea of the opinion leader. Whether it's a Guardian columnist or someone that you trust and admire who is endorsing something, or it's just someone in your actual groups that you most respect. That actually that's sort of the key thing, one of the key things that makes a media signal actually have an effect. But basically just throwing an idea on a TV commercial and putting it into someone's living room is not going to do much at all, is what they find. That's what limited effects means, okay? All right, that's in a nutshell. The effect of family is especially important on political partisanship, right? So as I'm sure you know, a good predictor of someone's like political orientation is what their parents' political orientation is. It's not perfect at all, but there is a correlation there. And so if you grow up in a conservative family, you are more likely to be conservative. If you grow up in a lefty family, you're more likely to be lefty, right? So that family is an example of the primary group or the immediate kind of sociological embeddedness of your life. All right. So these are all studies associated with the Columbia School, emphasizing these sort of sociological aspects. All right. So that's basically a completely different way of thinking about the media that produces totally different effects, where now all of a sudden the media is seen as actually not so powerful. All these ideas about how the media is going to transform people's mentalities and how the media is going to brainwash people and the government and marketing actors are going to implant messages in people's minds, and it's all going to be chaos and all these interesting, powerful effects that people are predicting throughout the 20th century. These people, these social scientists, are saying no, actually, it doesn't work like that. People are actually very resistant to being affected by the media. The media has limited effects. It's so weird. Right. So, media is rarely a direct cause of opinion change. When media does have an effect, it's highly conditional on the person's primary group. And though media does appear to have a robust effect in reinforcing previously held opinions. That's right, that's something I didn't mention, but that is something that they do find in these studies, is that media can have an effect in making you more likely to believe something if you already believe it, okay? That was something that they noted, and that is kind of interesting. Again, it's still a limited effect because the point is the media, no amount of television broadcasting is going to change your mind about something that you deeply believe, basically. But if you already kind of think something, watching a lot of media in support of that belief is going to make you a little bit more confident in it, okay? Hint, that's actually an example of positive feedback, isn't it? If you really think something, if you're really confident in a certain idea, you might seek out media that confirms that and gives you more information and data supportive of what you believe, and then that in turn makes you more likely to believe it, and even more in turn later to seek out more media looking for confirmation of that. Okay. So interestingly, in other words, even in the limited effects school, one of the effects they actually do find is has this kind of cybernetic structure, which is interesting. All right. Positive feedback. All right. So what happened? Why are we talking about that? First of all, what happened? Why did the dominant thinkers of media go from thinking media would have all these big, massive effects to the dominant thinkers of media coming to emphasize these very narrow, conditional effects? Why did that happen? But also, what are we to make of it? Right? How do you process that? What is the truth? Does media have these massive effects, or does media is that wrong, and media only has these minor effects? These are both questions that we want to understand. All right, and I think the answer is going to be something like, and I'll try to kind of break this down for you, but I think the answer will be something like, well, I kind of alluded to this in a previous comment. These different schools of thought basically are breaking off different parts of the puzzle. And so if you look at the puzzle in this kind of highly narrow, specific way that the new mainstream kind of social science chose to do, then you're going to find limited effects. But if you think about information technology in a larger sense, and you think about media in a larger sense, then it's also perfectly possible that media is having systemic, massive, society-wide effects, and also in a concrete and specific set of media messages, the effects are really quite limited. Okay, so on the one hand, I think the answer to this puzzle is that both of these things can be true at the same time. Okay, but there are reasons why kind of the mainstream intellectual focus changes. Okay, and I would put it to you that the reason that basically, what people in a society pay attention to, what gets selected as the influential kind of popular conventional wisdom, well, that itself that's politically determined in a sense, and that's, I would say, technologically, or let's say techno-economically, it's downstream of techno-economic changes, I think. All right. Another way of saying that is that the larger and extraordinary, remember the previous lectures that we went over, a lot of them have been about really trying to drill home to you how momentous and significant and exponential are the kind of techno-economic changes taking place in the middle of the 20th century. Because those are so significant and rapid and taking place at a kind of abstract, systemic, general level that's like way beyond our kind of limited human individual brain processing, power. There are kind of significant, rapid transformations in the technological nature of society that I think are shaping what people are able to think or not think, and especially what gets selected as kind of popular or what gets selected as dominant. And I think we see so I think that basically the actual history of academic research is a kind of very nice case study of how this works, because we can actually watch how people like the early cybernetics folks like Norbert Wiener, we can see how that idea and that kind of mathematical scientific insight into how society works, we can see how that gets pushed aside in favor of these other methods that have totally different findings and implications. I think that is in part because of the deeper, more basic transformations in the nature of kind of capitalism at the time, basically. So let me try to spell out how that might be. So basically, as I said before, explicit cybernetics disappears from academic political research. And so I think one way that, in other words, you could reconceptualize academic research at this time, people like Paul Lazarsfeld in the Columbia School, very, very smart, very, brilliant analysts, for sure. But what they're doing, changes. I think that, if you think about like academia and the university, in a general sense, like what is an academic? Well, an academic wants to pursue knowledge, right, for the sake of knowledge, and wants to do it in relative insulation for market pressures, right? But if you want to pursue knowledge for the sake of knowledge, without having to make your own money, without it having to be profitable, right? The academic to pursue knowledge, you can't also have to make profit, right? Because if you want to make profit, then you have to subordinate everything you're doing to profit. So the academic ideally wants to just pursue the truth, right? But you need to come up with some way to support that, right? Because if your research is not making you money directly, you need to get money from somewhere, right? So academia is this kind of weird thing, right? Where we're interested in protecting substantive rationality in a sense, truth for truth's sake. If you go back to the earlier lectures when I talked about substantive rationality is about trying to figure out the truth of things. not necessarily for any particular purpose, but just to figure out what is the truth, to reveal what is hidden, and to have an accurate account of things, right? That's substantive rationality. But if you're doing that, you're not going to be making money because it's not monetarily very useful, and often it's actually costly, right? It doesn't make profit. It actually spends profit in some sense, but it's valuable and it's important to life, right? So that's why we want to do it. Okay, but what I'm getting at is that academia is this sort of weird contradictory thing where, like, to have that freedom from the market, you have to kind of make all of these bargains with people who do have money, right? And so academia is instrumentally rational in the sense that, you know, we make bargains with governments and corporations so that they can give us money, right? So that we can have support, so we can have financial support to pursue our, you know, substantively rational interests. Okay. So what happens at this time, I think, is that this sort of instrumental dependence gets kind of hypercharged. And, you know, because if you look at people like Paul Lazarsfeld, one of the things, and the Columbia School, one of the things that really marks them out is that they become kind of mercenaries for corporate entities and governments. So the Columbia School and this sort of survey research that's coming out at the time that's finding limited effects, a lot of that research is directly being funded by businesses that want to know how to manipulate people. Okay, so they're literally getting money directly from businesses and then going to do these studies to see if they can teach businesses how to manipulate people for very specific instrumental purposes. Okay. Of course, Lazarsfeld is interested in the nature of sociology and how people actually think. So he's getting to do this sort of substantively fascinating research about, you know, how people actually operate. But he's kind of increasingly, you know, this, in other words, academia, what I'm saying is that academic research is increasingly getting instrumentalized for purposes that are outside of its own kind of control, all right? So that's what I think is going on. To protect substantive rationality, you have to make increasingly kind of subservient bargains. And you can think of it as a kind of rent-seeking. Like, academia is a kind of rent-seeking, if you think about it. Rent-seeking is just a term for, like, non-productive work, basically using bureaucracy and things like that to maintain privileges without necessarily being economically productive. So rent-seeking is generally seen as a bad thing because it's you're basically kind of trying to carve out for yourself privileges. And in a sense, academia is that, in some sense, right? So that's important because I'm going to argue in later slides that as this stuff kind of intensifies and as, you know, as society becomes hyper-instrumental, I'm going to argue that there's this bifurcation in forms of labor in some sense, where, like, the hyper-intelligent, hyper-conscientious, you know, techno-economic elite basically go into, like, hyper-efficient production, and then the rest of us, who are kind of like normal people, will find roles in society that are basically in kind of rent-seeking professions or spaces, if you will. So like most bureaucracy, a lot of bureaucracies, for instance, whether it be academic or lots of other bureaucracies, I mean, rent-seeking is a kind of cynical or negative term, so it's a little ideologically loaded. I don't mean it in that way. I just mean, if you think about it, a lot of the modern world, a lot of the jobs and institutions and bureaucracies that we have in modern societies, they don't actually make stuff. But they give people jobs. They give people something to do, right? So that's kind of all I'm talking about, is that the modern world becomes bifurcated. You know, like, or think about journalism, right? Like the average like Guardian columnist, right? Or like a Fox News anchor, whatever it might be. They're not like making something that's like valuable. They're kind of like feeding people this like digital, non-existent, unreal kind of like experience or kind of information consumption that people desire, or that tastes good, or, you know, that has some sort of like moralistic kind of consumption value. but they're not like producing things, right? They're not like making value. Okay, so basically, what I'm trying to kind of sketch that there's a bifurcation that happens in which hyper intelligent kind of entities become hyper productive in the actual production of value and things like that, and then lots of other normal people have to kind of carve out bureaucratic space in which they have a certain amount of privilege. And academia is just one example of that. I think like lots of forms of kind of cultural production are also like that. But that's kind of abstract. So why don't we just proceed? So what I think, in other words, is that cybernetic intelligence advances, like the insights of people like Norbert Wiener, the idea that physical systems and human systems and social systems can be understood in the same vocabularies. This idea, it doesn't go away. It actually is true, and it actually grows and evolves just outside of academia. Okay? That's basically one of the things that I think is happening, because you see all of these interesting bifurcations, like precisely as academia is kind of becoming more narrow, more specific, kind of bureaucratic institution, businesses are getting increasingly complex and intellectually provocative, and really kind of making fundamental advancements in how they operate and what they even do. So let me try and back this out. So basically, one of the things that happens at around this time, from like let's say the 1950s, let's say the 1960s onward, is it seems to me that there's all of this kind of in the economic spheres, like with economic firms and entrepreneurs and things like that. In other words, people who are really trying to produce value on an open market. Well, if you look at those people, I think you see cybernetic intelligence actually developing and taking place. So you see Norbert Wiener's ideas and the ideas of cybernetics actually coming into being applied, and changing the world of economic production. You see that, okay? It's only in other kind of cultural bureaucracies like academia where that starts to not happen, okay? So this is what I'm trying to understand, and let me try and kind of make the case. I talk about here in this slide, I talk about double loop learning. So what I mean by that, that's just a term that comes out of like management, leadership theory or whatever. It's not it's not too important or technical. It's just a nice little simplifier for basically when single loop learning is like when you're trying to do something and you're learning to do that thing better, right? But double loop learning is when you are actually learning about the nature of what you're doing. So basically, it's like a cybernetic kind of learning process as opposed to just a linear learning process. So like when you apply your learning to the very question of what it is you're even doing, okay? That's double loop learning. That's a kind of cybernetic intensification, if you will. You see this happening in the business world a lot, I think, from like this time point onward. So one example is like global mega brands that stop selling things. Okay, I mean this is like happening under the hood of the past several decades, but it's not at all obvious. You're not really taught this. It's kind of hidden from plain sight unless you really think about it. For most of human history, like companies that bought and sold, that whatever made stuff, companies that made stuff, they made things, they made objects, right? But at a certain point in just the past few decades, you actually see mega powerful, mega successful and profitable corporations that actually, they stop making things. They don't actually make things. What they actually make, the actual value that they are supplying is like an idea or it's a meaning. So you realize like Apple, for instance, Apple computers. Like Apple computers does not make computers. You get that, right? They don't make phones. They don't make computers. They don't do that. It's very counterintuitive. Most people take it as obvious that Apple makes phones and computers. Apple does not make phones and computers. Companies like Foxconn, and they contract that out to smaller companies. The actual making of phones and computers, Apple doesn't do. Apple hires smaller companies to make phones and computers. Apple does not make phones and computers. What Apple really makes is a brand. It's that idea of the Apple computer. And then it's obviously the kind of supply chain management that connects all of those subcontractors that actually make the computers and phones. Apple organizes all of that, right? They connect the producers and the suppliers and the retail links, like that kind of supply chain management. Apple does. But really, what Apple does is the idea behind it, right? So that's really important to understand. That's a new thing, okay? That the actual value, the actual kind of significance behind these mega brands such as Apple or Nike is another good example. They're selling a whole lifestyle, right? They have that power and that market domination because they have symbols that they own, and those symbols basically monopolize an idea, okay? They monopolize a lifestyle, all right? With, Apple, it's obviously, it's like visionary, creative, digital intelligence, right? It's open-minded, progressive, cosmopolitan, social change and creativity, and these sorts of things are all evoked by the Apple brand. Nike is another good example because Nike was sort of one of the first companies really that kind of launched out in this new form of new type of double loop learning. Like Phil Knight kind of realized at a certain point that Nike is not about selling shoes and sportswear. That Nike is actually selling a fundamentally different thing, and this is what I mean by double loop learning. This is a kind of cybernetic realization, all right? And it starts to happen around the 1980s with companies such as, Nike, where they realize they're not selling shoes and sportswear. They realize they're selling an idea, okay? And they go hard on that. All right, so that's just that one bullet point, okay? We'll talk a little bit more about that. But you also see increasingly recursive operations research, and what I mean by that is, the actual energy and time and attention and resources that businesses devote to actually studying themselves increases, right? So, things like making supply chains increasingly, efficient. Things like minimizing costs and how to manage personnel. All of these things get increasingly scientific. They get increasingly data rich, right? Because we have information technology that allows us to track data more and more efficiently at a more and more fine-grained level. And we're able to use things like statistics, which themselves are being developed in part because computers and things like that are allowing us to get a better understanding of of different statistical techniques, right? So data is increasing, statistical capacity is increasing, the ability to compute is increasingly efficient. All of these things are happening at once, right? In this sort of rapid technological explosion, and it's leading companies to rapidly bootstrap themselves, basically, to make themselves hyper intelligent. And they're doing this rapidly because it's a competitive marketplace, and that's what they have to do. So the ultimate outcome of this sort of thing is something like Amazon.com today, where the supply chain of something like Amazon.com is so incredibly sophisticated to the point that Amazon basically ships products before people order them. They know how many products are going to be ordered in a particular region before people are even ordered. So literally, like, Amazon is shipping you all products, all of us right now. It is shipping to us products that we have not ordered yet. They've already started to ship it. They're that sort of far ahead in understanding the world in which they're operating, and that's because they've channeled extraordinary resources to improving their own the sophistication of their own operations. Right? Again, it's cybernetics. So they're applying their work on themselves to make their work even better, which can then apply it onto themselves. And they've gotten so good at it to the point that they're able to ship products to people before they even order using big data and machine learning, right? Okay, so that's another example, right? So so keep in mind, again, these are all things that these are things that academics are not doing. For instance, just I take academics as I'm kind of bullying academics because I am one, so that's fair. I'm not like attacking other people. I'm kind of being self-reflective about my own kind of place in the world. Like, these are all things that are not happening in academia, okay? And that's the contrast, right? But you could, not just academia, any other bureaucratic institution that's insulated from the market, these things are not happening in them. Okay? So just keep that in mind. Information technology is making marketing increasingly sophisticated. So things like, market segmentation. In previous periods, if you wanted to sell, cigarettes or whatever it might be, some product, you more or less kind of sold it to people at large, whoever wanted to buy it. You tried to kind of sell things to as many people as you could, whatever. But that's in part because we formerly didn't have the technology to understand the differences between people and to separate people and to send some messages to some groups, but other different messages to other groups based on an understanding of how those people are different. That is something you only get to do when you have highly refined data about different types of people, and then you have highly refined techniques for sorting out the differences between those people. Again, data, computers, statistics, you need those things at a certain level of sophistication to be able to break people up into different groups and sell to them differently. These things are getting supercharged, right, all around this time. Okay, finally, commodities become marketing vehicles for other commodities. This is something that I think is super important. That's, again, is taking place at precisely this sort of time period. What do I mean by this? If you look at movies, for instance, or like cultural products, movies nowadays are increasingly it's not like a cultural product. It's not like an artist came up with an artwork and then they're selling tickets to go see their artwork. That's kind of what movies were once upon a time, in the age of the auteur. But nowadays, movies are largely or many movies, some movies are actually designed from the first stage to simply sell you other things, right? And you see this with lots of different types of industries, where like one commodity is actually just a pretext for marketing to you some other commodity, right? So let me give you an example. For instance, I know I've been waxing quite abstract for a while. How many of you have seen the movie Space Jam? Really? Only a few? Okay, a few, yeah. But not all of you. Well, it's sort of a funny movie, and I think today, those of you who've seen it, it's kind of like, I think people like to kind of talk about Space Jam as being cool. It's kind of like fashionable to say Space Jam is a cool, funny movie, in a kind of nostalgic or ironic, kind of hipster way, I think. I know people who have said things like this. I personally think it was like you don't need to know my opinions about the movie. I was going to say, it's like a totally ridiculous, I think, terrible movie personally, but that's just my 2 cents. Anyway, the reason I ask about it is that, I don't know how many of you know this, but Space Jam is basically, it's basically a commercial for Michael Jordan and all of his sponsorships. I mean, it was more or less literally designed to be a commercial, more or less. And so it's not like, once upon a time, an author would design an artistic product, or a filmmaker would make a movie, and yeah, maybe you would get some sponsors to be able to afford to make the movie. Or for TV shows, for instance, like you would have commercials in your TV show, just because you have to find a way to fund it, right? Artists, for most of history, kind of make these negotiations and bargains with people who have money being able to do the art that they want to do, right? But at a certain time, in like the 80s and 90s, the relationship becomes actually reversed to such an extreme degree that movies are actually, it's not like there's an artist kind of negotiating with some sponsor. It's the sponsors themselves start making the movies for their own intentions. And so Space Jam is a kind of an example of this, where like the very idea of it was only really to kind of promote Michael Jordan's brands, like Nike and Wheaties and whatever it might be. And so it's very fascinating because like I remember watching this. I remember when this movie came out. I forget how old I was or whatever. Well, I was 10 years old actually. I remember seeing Space Jam or whatever. And you have no idea. You have no idea of the kind of techno-economic kind of changes that are taking place under the surface. Like I had no idea that Space Jam was basically a big advertisement. Okay. Here's a clip from it to give you a sense. This is one of the lines from Space Jam. It just shows, in retrospect, now that we kind of know these things and we have this kind of larger historical kind of narrative, looking back on that movie, like if you go and watch it tonight, you'll be able to see, oh my God, this is such a joke. Like this is just a big commercial. It's so, with hindsight, it's like offensive to me how kind of exploitative it is. Get your Hanes on, lace your Nikes up, grab your Wheaties and your Gatorade, and we'll pick up a Big Mac on the way to the ballpark. He literally says that in one sentence. All right, in this scene. Okay, so it's so over the top, but you don't realize it when you're watching it. Okay, so this is just one example of what I mean by commodities become a vehicle for selling other commodities. Okay, so this is we're no longer talking about movies. We're talking about making a commodity that is its literal purpose is to make you buy other commodities. Okay, and everything is subordinated to that. All right, so that's just an example, a kind of funny example, I think. This is all one part of my argument, is that basically the stuff that Norbert Wiener and the cybernetic theorists were arguing and finding in their research, what I'm arguing basically is that they were right, and information technology and media indeed has these kind of system-wide effects that function like a kind of nervous system for the body, distributing and redistributing the flows and the particles of the body in a large to kind of generate larger systemic homeostasis or something like that, something along that kind of metaphor. That those effects are very real. That information technology and the media are in fact coming to have those effects, but it's in a way that's implicit. It's real and it's happening. So it doesn't really matter if academics study it or not, because it's real and it's happening. So in other words, the insights of cybernetics they go into practice. In other words, they become adopted, but not by humans, by the social system. Okay, and this is where it gets kind of far out. But you have to understand that it's not that human beings are learning cybernetics and applying cybernetics to their lives. It's that our actual social system is becoming increasingly cybernetically sophisticated. So, it's capitalism itself. It's the market itself that is with increasing sophistication, telling human beings what to do and how to do it. Okay? So when you see things like movies becoming increasingly instrumental in this sort of self-referential, commodified way, that's not like humans are learning cybernetics and applying it to their lives. It's that the actual social system is becoming increasingly refined in its capacity to shape our attitudes and behaviors. All right? So that's just one kind of set of data points that reflects this kind of advancement of cybernetic intelligence to basically a kind of market level. All of these kinds of things that you're seeing. This is the market itself becoming smarter, more smart. This is the market itself and the market logic becoming increasingly sophisticated, that it's increasingly overpowering us to the point that we don't even know what's going on. It's hard to even see these things happening. Like when I watched Space Jam and had no idea the kind of watershed that we're living through when these types of things take over. What else? But I think there are other kind of data points here that are necessary to go over. So I think that, and I've alluded to this before, but I want to go into a little bit more detail here. The radical 1960s, and then what is called neoliberalism, as we went over in a previous lecture, is, I think we can see it as a kind of sequential, personality conditioned, systemic learning episode. Okay, so what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that as all of these things are happening, and as society is becoming increasingly kind of cybernetically intensified through information processing efficiency, let's say, as capitalism is becoming increasingly intelligent and being able to kind of manipulate us in ways that are increasingly opaque to us, but that are increasingly efficient for it. As that is happening, human beings respond to that in different ways based on the ways in which we are different. Right? So human beings are different. There are certain ways in which we all vary. And because we vary in certain systematic ways, we are going to respond to this cybernetic intensification in different ways. All right. And so in a nutshell, one way that you can understand, from like the 1960s to the 1980s is different people responding differently to these trends. So what you see in the 1960s is people, anti-capitalist people who find exploitation to be, disgusting and horrifying. People who want to just be compassionate, people who are compassionate, people who are want us all to get along, right? You see things like the hippies, right? You see things like the mass protest movements. It's a kind of flourishing of lefty people, especially lefty people, compassionate people, people who just want to get along. You see that flowering in the 1960s in response to this, because all these people in the 1960s are looking around at what's happening and they're saying, this is horrifying. The military-industrial complex and capitalism are becoming increasingly insane and horrifying and leading to these terrible things like the war in Vietnam and all these problems at home. We need to stop this. I think that's kind of why you see this mass, spontaneous cultural energy in the 1960s. That's kind of basically anti-capitalist. You see the hippies, the yippies. It's a kind of mass response of a certain type of person, basically, who finds this sort of intensification, this capitalistic intensification horrifying. They spontaneously rebel because they find it horrifying. Okay? And then neoliberalism, what we talked about in the last session, where we talked about how in the 1980s there was this kind of right-wing reaction that you saw in multiple countries where, wealthy elites promoted certain candidates and promoted certain media messages and were able to achieve things like getting people like Reagan and Thatcher into power. And, I'm not saying that was like a product of like a wealthy elite conspiracy or something. That's not the case. But in fact, it's quite the opposite. It's just that people who disliked the 1960s also responded in a spontaneous systemic way, not because they were an organized cabal, but because they were different types of people. Okay, so some of you look a little confused. So what I need to do now is I need to go back over something a little bit more basic that some of you might not really understand, because you probably wouldn't have been exposed to this, but it's super important. It's that it's the importance of personality in politics. Okay, so I'm going to do it a little aside to kind of make some sense out of what I'm saying. I need to go into something in a little bit more detail, and it's what exactly do I mean when I talk about personality? Okay, and what exactly is the relationship between personality and political opinion? So, in a nutshell, I'm going to do that for like 5 minutes, and that will probably that will help you understand this point that I'm making about what I mean by personality conditioned. Okay, so bracket, pause your mind. We're going to do an aside, and then we'll come back to this. Okay, primer on personality traits. Basically, the quick and dirty of this is that years and years of psychological research has found that there are basically 5 main personality traits that human beings have. Okay, how many of you have ever taken psychology classes? Okay, yeah, not many, just a few. So this will probably be your first exposure to this. So I'll make it really quick and simple. People have tried for a long time to figure out like what are the ways in which human beings are similar or different. And so you might describe people in all number of different ways. You might say, oh, this person is nice, this person is kind, this person is mean, this person is nasty. You can describe people in a million ways, right? But which of those ways are the really significant ways in which people are the same or different? That's an empirical question. And basically people have studied, so psychologists have studied this for a while, and through years and years of studies, all kinds of studies, they've been able to narrow it down to what exactly are the main dimensions that unite and divide us. Okay? And I'll just tell you quickly what they are. Okay? One, so the mnemonic for this is the ocean, OCEAN, where O is for openness, so openness to experience. Basically, that's associated with kind of having an open mind, being creative, being accepting of all different types of people. That's openness to experience. It's one of the main personality traits. Second one, C, is for conscientiousness, which basically means, being really interested and concerned about rules, following rules, being concerned with order, things like law and order, also being very productive and responsible. Okay, that's what conscientiousness means. All right. E is for extroversion, which is just like it sounds. It means, really needing to be around other people, getting energy from being around other people, right? The opposite, and enjoying that and getting energy from that. The opposite of extroversion is obviously introversion, where like you just do not like to be around people as much, or you find it very draining to be around people. A is for agreeableness, and agreeableness is basically, it means it's associated with really caring about what people think about you, wanting to be respected and liked in your community, not wanting to hurt people's feelings, things like being polite, being compassionate. That's agreeableness, okay? And finally, N is for neuroticism, or the more politically correct term is emotional instability, and that just basically means things like being moody, being volatile, having tendency to withdraw from threat and fear, being very threat sensitive, being very fearful. Okay, Ocean. Those are the 5 big personality traits, and we are all significantly different on all of these 5 traits. There are significant differences in human beings. Okay, and most of the other things that you describe people with, like if you call the other words that you would describe people with, you might call someone mean, or you might call someone funny, or fun to hang around with. All of those other ways of describing people are synonyms for these 5 big traits, right? So if you think of someone as mean, what that probably means is they have the personality trait of low agreeableness. If you think of someone as really nice, that means they're high agreeableness for the most part. So these are the 5 real kind of dimensions of human personality traits. Okay, so guess why that matters? Well, it matters for a few reasons, but there are 2 that are really important. One is that political ideology is to a large degree a function of personality traits. Okay, so can you guess what the left is associated with and what the right is associated with? And this is pretty well documented. I mean, there have been lots of studies on this. It's a pretty hard. There's some debate and there's always some uncertainty, but there's a pretty consistent finding that think about your own self. Like if you are a lefty, you generally support left-wing parties and left-wing ideas. You're probably higher on openness, okay, and you're also lower on conscientiousness. Yeah, you're shaking your head like, yeah, that's me. No. And if you're a right-winger, shy Tories in the room, you probably are lower on openness and higher on conscientiousness. That's one of the main kind of psychological differences between lefties and righties. It's the openness dimension and it's the conscientiousness dimension. Okay, and think about it. It makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Right-wing people, they have a different left-wing people and right-wing people. They are different types of people. It's not like they're all just kind of evaluating the political issues differently or something like that, or have different kind of interpretations of the facts. No, they have their feelings and their attitudes towards the world operate differently on a biological level. We're different types of people, okay, and that's really important to understand. A lot of people don't get that. So, as I said, lefties are more open and lower conscientious, and right-wing people are higher conscientious and less open. Okay, and that makes sense, doesn't it? It's very consistent with like what the policy positions are, right? Like right-wing people want law and order, yeah, because they're high on conscientiousness. They have a strong demand, a personal need for law and order based on their personality. And left-wing people want, we can have as many immigrants in the country as we want because we're open to differences. We're open to any different types of people. Lefty people, are open to that. Okay, so part of their personality. Okay, I think you get the idea. So, for instance, if you want to just look at some data real quick, this is from some analysis of the 2015 general election data in the UK from the LSE blog that I found, and basically it's very consistent with what I was just saying. The Green Party, for instance, is very high on openness down here at the bottom, super high on openness. And UKIP is very low on openness, right? It makes perfect sense, doesn't it? If you're really high on openness, yeah, we can have as many immigrants as you want. It doesn't matter. Love everyone, accept everyone. You're going to be a hippie, right? Like that's what a hippie is, right? Super high on openness. Everyone's good. Love everyone, accept everyone. We can have as many immigrants as we want. It doesn't matter. Everyone's good. That's super high openness. That's the Green Party, right? If you're low on openness, you're like, no, I don't want all kinds of strangers around me. I don't like that. I'm not open to different types of experiences. You're gonna be more likely to vote UKIP, right? And you can see the other, but on the other hand, the Green Party, super low on conscientiousness, right? So yeah, you got the idea. All right, so why am I going over this primer on personality traits? Well, because the way that I see it, because we're talking about, throughout this module, we've been talking about these massive, rapid, and kind of exponential techno-economic changes that are happening around the middle of the 20th century, when a significant society-wide techonomic explosion occurs, you would expect people to respond to it differently, right? And if it's really happening at a society-wide level, then you would expect pretty large scale, but not organized, totally spontaneous, and yet correlated changes of attitude and behavior from different groups of people based on how they're inclined to interpret something. So basically, what I really think is happening in kind of the second half of the 20th century is that information revolution kicks off, the cybernetic intensification of capitalism exponentially multiplies, businesses, as I kind of outlined, get hyper-intelligent, hyper-exploitative, hyper-effective. Those are disproportionately going to be conscientious people, right, who high intelligence, high conscientiousness, low agreeableness. But people who, like the Green Party people, right, people who are super high on openness and super low on conscientiousness, they're going to look at this and they're going to say, this is horrible. This is the end of humanity. This is the world is collapsing. We need to stop this because this is completely unacceptable. So you spontaneously see all of the high openness, low conscientious people become hippies and move to San Francisco and do lots of drugs and protest the government and all, it's this kind of mass uprising of the high openness, low conscientious people saying, this is horrible. We have to stop this. Meanwhile, the conscientious people who want law and order, right, and just want us to all be productive and take care of our families and keep out dangerous strangers, those people are looking at the 60s and they're saying, oh my God, these hippies and protesters are destroying society. This is getting out of hand. They're gonna take over the government. They're gonna take over all of our functions for law and order. We need to stop this. We need to protect our assets. We need to protect our money. We need to protect our interests. And those people in the 1980s, in an equally kind of unorganized, kind of spontaneous social political evolution, manifest themselves in the form of people such as Reagan and Thatcher, in a kind of direct backlash to the spontaneous kind of social political explosions of radical leftism in the 1960s. Okay, so that's what I mean by sequential personality conditioned systemic learning episodes. These are not people making decisions about large scale social organizations. It's different types of individuals responding at the same time to massively disruptive techno-economic change because they're different types of people. And because the system, in some ways, is distributing them in different ways. Okay? That's what I think is going on. And that's why I went over the primer on personality, because it's really important, I think, for understanding how different groups of people responded differently to this kind of massive technological change that I'm trying to kind of theorize as basically the information revolution. Okay, I won't keep you any longer. Thanks, folks.